Coming up on this episode of Photography Online, we go to the moon as we hear about the newly remastered Apollo photos, we tell you why a cable release is still a key accessory to have, and we critique some of the photos you've sent in. Welcome to another brand new episode of Photography Online. We haven't been here with a new show for a while because we've had so much going on, which I'll be telling you more about a little bit later on. In addition to everything we've just told you to expect on this show, we also have a gallery of the rainbow photos that you sent us in response to our Subject Project feature that we did a couple of months ago. But before all of that, let's launch the show in style as we venture back in time and all the way to the moon on the NASA Apollo missions. Andy Saunders has spent the past 12 years scrupulously going through over 35,000 frames of stills and movie footage taken in space and on the moon, applying modern processing methods to reveal detail never seen before. Mark has caught up with him for a chat and to see some of the results of his work.
Tell me how this whole project got started, because I'm assuming that it wasn't just a case of phoning up NASA and saying, hey, can I remaster some of your original photos, please?
No, in fact, and I didn't really need permission specifically from NASA. NASA's got this open source policy that makes all of its data available. So this original flight film that had come out of the freezer, which is what I've been working on, that was scanned by NASA and is available as basically raw data, raw files. So it was those were the files that I accessed. And in terms of starting the process, I mean, the reasons go right back to childhood, really. I've always had a fascination with the Apollo moon landings. I've always loved photography. I can't really put my finger on what it was about the moon landings. Just always had that fascination of like a childhood fascination with rockets and space and, visiting the moon. And when I'd learned that people had been to the moon, that blew my mind. And that's when I got obsessed with it, to be honest. I wanted to know who these people were, what did they look like, what did the spacecraft look like. But from a very young age, I was conscious that something very important was missing, because I wanted to see Neil Armstrong on the moon, this absolutely pivotal moment in human history, but I couldn't see him. And we've never been able to because he held the camera. So the photographs we see are actually of Buzz Aldrin, which is just, in today's world is unthinkable. When you imagine when Artemis goes back to the moon and the first woman walks on the moon, the concept that they come back and we say, can we see a picture of the first woman on the moon? No, we took pictures of everybody else and of some rocks and things, but no. But they took one camera and he held the camera for most of the EVAs out on the surface. So there was no image of him. So that's when as my knowledge of digital processing got better, I understood this concept of stacking. So it's something used in astrophotography. A lot of your people that watch this may be aware of stacking, whereby you would actually film, say, the planet Mars, and therefore you get hundreds of frames, all of which are slightly different, and the noise is in a slightly different place on each frame. And when you stack them on top of each other and consolidate them, you can pull out a lot more detail. And I just thought, well, if you can put Mars through this software and through this technique, why can't we put Neil Armstrong through it? And they took a small format movie camera. They're called the DAC camera, 16mm film, like an old cine film style camera, obviously inherently noisy and low quality when you look at it frame by frame, but in stacking them on top of each other, consolidating them, and I produced this image of Armstrong. And as I was producing it, I just couldn't believe the amount of detail I was able to pull out. And as someone that's always been obsessed with this, it was almost in that moment like I'd gone back in time and I was standing in the lunar module looking out the window watching this incredible moment in history unfold in this detail. And that's when I just became hooked on the process and decided to assess the whole back catalogue of imagery from Apollo.
I know obviously it's a difficult answer for this, but what would you say was the average time that you spent on each photo? I know it would have differed, but if you had to throw a figure out there.
A lot of them are relatively straightforward. The frame just needs balancing, getting the colour right, getting the levels right. and are probably kind of 3 or 4 hours-ish. More difficult ones are perhaps a day, and some that I would classify more as a restoration rather than a remastering, such as the front cover, that was 2 days or more. So when that was massively, massively underexposed. So once you start lifting the levels enough to be able to see what's in that frame, all kinds of artifacts come out. I mean, it's such a difficult manual process to get it to look right, and to get it perfect. And with, for example, with the cover shot, when you know it's going to be an absolutely amazing image as a portrait, this cinematic atmospheric shot. It's also a very historic moment. So I research every photograph. I talked to some of the Apollo astronauts. I talked to Rusty Schweikart, who actually took that photograph, to understand what was happening in that moment. And it's actually a very historic moment. It's the first ever docking of 2 crewed spacecraft, a very key part in the Apollo program. And yet we have this atmospheric cinematic shot as well. You know, I had an idea this could be a front cover. So to perfect that one was a good couple of days. The stacking, also very, very laborious process. So I often separate all these frames, potentially up to hundreds, and manually align them if necessary. And then doing a simple stacking, for example, with the Armstrong image, the camera was locked off in the window and he stayed relatively still for several frames. So it's quite easy to align and stack those. But with much of the footage I wanted to use, this was handheld by an astronaut floating in 0G. He's not a professional cinematographer either. And he's filming somebody else that's also floating in 0G. And he's panning the camera around, and then a roll of tape will go, floating across the frame. So to align and stack that in the traditional way is just impossible. So I had to kind of develop my own technique for taking account of all that movement and applying the stacking to get that detail benefit. But the beauty of that, and that is days per photograph, per image. But the beauty is that camera was particularly good at capturing the inside of the spacecraft. And it's something we'd very rarely see. I've always wanted to know, what's it like on board the spacecraft? I want the reader to almost step on board and ride along with these space explorers on the most incredible ever human expedition. I've always wanted to do that. I've wanted to look out the windows that they look out of, see what they saw, how they saw it. So this stacking technique allows us to do that.
Most of the people watching this will be familiar with the standard digital editing software, primarily Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom. Did you use bog standard equipment, or were you using specialized software?
Bog standard. I stayed well clear of AI. I think AI has got its place, particularly perhaps with like frame interpolation and Dane and that kind of thing. But with still photographs of a historical significance and importance, such as the Apollo program, I didn't want a piece of software inventing pixels and inserting them somewhere that I wasn't aware of. I wanted to know exactly what I started with, what I've changed, and what's there at the end. It's very important that this is an authentic record because it is such historically important footage.
So do you think that if the original photos, let's just say the moon landings had been, 40 years later than they were, and they'd been taken digitally in the first place rather than on film, do you think that the end result would be far inferior to what we've got as it stands?
I think so. I mean, we're going to find out because we're going back to the moon. There's a mission on the way to the moon now. Next time that goes, it's going to have people on. We're going to see some new photographs. And of course, it'll all be digital. It'll be 360-degree field of view, VR enabled, live streamed. But to me, there's a warmth of the film. There's something nice about, it'll be instant when we go back from the moon. Like I say, it'll be live streamed. There's something romantic about, waiting till the astronauts got back from the moon with the film to process the film and, see what it was like. So, and of course, it's just this golden pioneering era that I think film somehow suits it. So if we saw it as digital can look quite clinical, can't it? And I think that's what I'd expect to see. Very vivid, but quite clinical images, and almost too many. There'll be thousands of that. Okay, they took 35,000 on Apollo, but we tend not to see a lot of them, and a lot of them are kind of quite repetitive, taken back remotely by these cameras that were in the service module rather than handheld shots. But we'll be absolutely bombarded with imagery from Artemis, but there's something very special about that. The warmth of film, that pioneering era, and then being so selective about the photographs they took in this extraordinary place.
Okay, so there'll be people watching this, and there's many people out there, and I'm sure you've spoken to many of them, who still are in denial that the moon landings actually happened and it was all fake. Now, similar to your story, I've been fascinated by space, and I was lucky enough to have dinner with Eugene Cernan. This is 20 years ago. Yeah. Obviously, he's passed now, and in fact, I've got his book here.
Very good. Yeah.
He very kindly signed for me. And before I met him and had dinner with him, he recounted some amazing stories, which I would love to recount now, but we don't have time. And I came away from that meal thinking there is absolutely no way that guy could have made up those stories. It's just it's beyond. You couldn't make them up because they were just so detailed and so out there. If you had a blank piece of paper and said, "Go on then, make a story up," it would have been the absolute opposite of what he was telling me. So I don't need any convincing, but there's lots of evidence that I've seen in various documentaries where there's very suspicious things that have been going on in some of the photos. One of the examples I'll give you would be there's a crosshair on one of the camera things which goes behind an aerial of the lunar. And what's your take on that? How did that happen, and what's your view on that?
Yeah, but the aerial is very bright, so you often wouldn't see the contrast of the tiny crosshairs that are etched into this Rousseau plate. There are things in the film, physical artifacts. Of course, this is a piece of film that was in a camera on the moon. There's dust. It's been handled. When it's got back, it's been processed. It's been scanned. So by the time we see the image, it's had physical manipulation. It can pick up debris. So there are also people that say you can see UFOs in some of them, but in fact, it's just some kind of foreign debris, minute, that's on that piece of film. But there are things in the film which do the opposite, that would convince someone there's no way this could have been faked. For example, on Apollo 14, Alan Shepard saw a crescent Earth above the lunar module, so he leaned back and he took a photograph to capture Earth. Now, I was editing this series of photographs, and I'm spot healing. There's so many little bits of debris on the film that I'd spot heal, and there was one piece that was quite stubborn. And then I noticed that actually it was on 5 consecutive frames and it was in the same place. So when I started to do more research, someone else has spotted this, and actually it's Venus. So it's a tiny, tiny bright speck, crescent Earth and Venus. And the software now, you can put into the software and say, okay, this is the date, 50 years ago. This is the location I'm on the moon. Where are all the planets? And it will tell you the crescent Earth is here, Venus is here, and you can superimpose that image onto the photograph, and Venus is in exactly the right place. So if someone wanted to try to tell me that 50 years ago they were faking 35,000 pieces of film, putting little bits of debris on and making sure that on one of them someone in 50 years might notice it's not debris, it's Venus, and we might have software that will predict that that's where Venus needs to be, there's absolutely no chance. I've been through 35,000 pieces of film. There is no way they are faked. It would be easier to just go to the moon and take the photographs.
Well, thank you for your time today, Andy. Before you go, anyone who's interested in seeing all of your work, where obviously you've got the book out, where else can they get access to it?
Yeah, so I'm putting on exhibitions. I've just finished one at the Royal Albert Hall. It's been there for about 8 weeks. There's kind of 40 to 50 large-scale C-type photographic prints and some huge panoramas on direct-to-media Dibond, kind of 2.4 meters wide. And then moving up to Glasgow Science Centre. That opens on the 24th of November, and it stays there until mid-April next year, at which point it moves to the northwest of England, to the Williamson Art Gallery, middle of April to September 2023. And I've also got a small kind of teaser exhibition, just a small part of the full exhibition at Jodrell Bank, which opens at the start of December this year and runs until April.
And for anybody outside the UK, because we have a worldwide audience, is there any access online that they can get to see some of your work?
Social media on Twitter at Andy Saunders _1, Instagram same at Andy Saunders _1. There's a Facebook page, Apollo Remastered, and I've got the website apolloremastered.com. So there's lots of information on there as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time.
Super, thank you.
We've put a link to all the ways you can see the newly remastered Apollo images. Plus, of course, you can buy the book if you're unable to get to one of the exhibition locations yourself. That interview was originally 30 minutes in duration, but we've cut it down for this show as we don't have time for the full-length version. But everything that we cut out is just as fascinating as the parts we left in. So if you want to see the full feature along with extra photos, we've uploaded it onto our sister channel, Mc2 Photography, for which there is a link in the usual place. Okay, well, in a few days' time we are off to Venice, where we'll be bringing you our next show and explaining a few major changes coming to photography online. We want to take the show to the next level, but can only do this if we reorganise things a little bit. So if you want to find out what's afoot, then don't miss our next show. Now, over the past 3 years, we have done features on all the essential contents of the average camera bag, with the exception of one must-have accessory. Here's Nick to explain.
In the previous show, I explained the reciprocal rule and how this determines when you may want to consider using a tripod to get the sharpest shots.
However, just because you've got the camera on the tripod doesn't mean you'll always get sharp shots.
An item of equipment which you may want to have in your camera bag is a remote release. These handy gadgets come in a few different kinds, such as cable release, cable-less release, and digital ones, which offer various options for controlling the camera's shutter. My preferred type is a cable kind, more on that later.
So why should we consider using a remote release? Well, there's several reasons actually, with the main one being to alleviate camera shake when pressing the shutter button, something which is especially important when using an exposure time of around 2 seconds to 1/60th of a second.
If we have an exposure time faster than 1/60th of a second, then the slight camera movement caused by us pressing the shutter button won't have much of an impact on the final image. If our exposure time is longer than 2 seconds, then any movement as we press the shutter will only exist for a small percentage of the total time of the exposure, so this too won't have much impact.
But if we're at something like 1/4 of a second, then the entire length of the exposure is likely to be affected by the movement of us touching the camera, so this should really be avoided. So why can't we simply use the self-timer of the camera?
Let's say we're out photographing a landscape and we have a reasonably slow exposure time, say 1 second, and the light is continually moving across the landscape. Using the 2-second timer may cause too much delay between shots, meaning that we could possibly miss that critical moment.
For example, when using the 2-second timer, the maximum number of shots you can take in a 10-second time window is 4, even when your exposure time is super fast.
This may be even more apparent when you're at the beach and shooting with a long exposure time to blur the movement in the water. With seascape photography, you quite often need to take into consideration your exposure time along with the optimum moment required to fire the shutter, so that the water is exactly where you want it during the exposure.
Say your exposure time is 2 seconds long and you want the water to reach the tripod during that exposure. You'll have a higher success rate if using a remote release rather than having to predict where the wave will be in 3 or 4 seconds time. As with the previous example, a cable release gives you the option to fire the shutter continuously rather than having to wait 2 seconds between each frame. First up, we have the cable-less remote release, which comes in options infrared or radio transmitter. Although you may consider being untethered to the camera as a good thing, for me, they're more trouble than they're worth.
The infrared sensor used to communicate with the remote is on the front of the camera and often causes problems when used from behind. The radio transmitter ones require setting up so that the hand unit talks to the receiver on the correct channel. In theory, this should be straightforward, but in practice it can be anything but.
I've seen many people missing the shot when using a wireless remote, so in my experience a wired remote is far simpler and more reliable, so that's why I use the second option, the cable release, which is tethered to the camera.
These come in a couple of options, a standard latch button or a digital timer. I use a non-digital kind. However, the digital cable release can give you various options such as timed exposures, where your exposure time can be longer than the 30 seconds which is standard with a lot of cameras. With the digital cable release, you simply tell it how long you want the exposure to be, press the start button, and you don't have to remember to end the exposure as you would using bulb mode with a non-digital release. Then there's continuous shooting, which comes in handy if you wish to shoot a time-lapse, whereby you input the delay between exposures and how many exposures you want the camera to fire. Many modern cameras have a time-lapse function built in. However, if yours doesn't, then you may find a programmable cable release useful.
Remote releases, whether they be cabled or cable-less, will cost you anywhere between £10 to £100. This is one of those areas where you need a really good reason to justify buying a branded one to suit your camera, rather than a third-party one like this, as they all do exactly the same job. An unbranded one might not last as long, but at a fraction of the cost, you can afford to buy many for the same price as a branded one. That way, if you lose it, it's not such a big deal.
Thanks, Nick. Now, if you've been watching photography online for a while, then you'll know all about our 2 essential camera skills books, which contain details of everything that we've covered in our first 2 seasons of the show. If you have these, then I've got good news, because the 3rd and final series will be available in the new year, but you can pre-order it now to ensure that you get a copy before they run out. Priced again at £12.50, the 3rd edition contains topics such as how to control lens flare, hyperfocal technique, how to get the most from any lens, focus stacking, predicting epic sunrises and sunsets, stitching panoramic images, plus chapters on how to photograph mountains and autumn colour as well. We're putting the finishing touches to it as we speak, so it shouldn't be too long before it's ready to be shipped. There is a link to order your copy in the usual place, and remember, it's buying things like these which really help to support the show, so thank you if you've bought copies in the past or are planning on ordering the new one. Okay, well, a couple of months ago we gave you lots of interesting facts and information on how to shoot rainbows, and then invited you to send us your results. As always, we've been inundated with photos and we can't possibly show all of them, but here's a gallery of a few which caught our eye. thanks to everybody who sent us photos. And if you didn't see your image there, please don't be disheartened. It's simply because we don't have time for all of them to appear on screen. Now, it has been a while since we opened the doors to the Photography Online surgery, so we thought it was about time to get the doctor back into the house to cast a critical eye over the images you've been sending in.
So it's been quite a while since we've had a live surgery on the show, so I'm back here to have another look at some of the images you've been sending in. I've selected just 5 shots that caught my eye, so let's dive straight into the first from Anthony Ward. Now, immediately, we've got a pretty obvious subject in this shot. We've got this beautiful tree with the colour behind, really well captured. Immediately obvious what the subject is, and that's always important. If you don't know what the subject is or where the eye should go, it's probably going to fail as a photograph. However, I am immediately distracted, unfortunately, by the reflection here being cut off just at the top. There may well have been a reason why it wasn't possible to include. Maybe you maybe couldn't have got low enough to the water. There may not have been more of the reflection to capture, but it is quite distracting, especially because it's only the top 10% of the tree that's missing. And when it's so still and calm like this, it's really sort of nice to have that mirroring effect and to have the whole tree. So if we're only missing just a little bit of the tree, I'd be tempted either to crop it a little bit tighter, if I can't include the whole of the reflection. Barring that, everything else is pretty spot on. The processing is really nicely done. The shadows haven't been brought up too high, so we've got a nice dark natural frame off to the left. Beautiful mist, absolutely beautiful morning shot. It's one of those locations that if I was living nearby, I'd want to revisit again and again and again, capture it through the seasons to create a beautiful portfolio, maybe a triptych of images to print. So really nice winter, cold, frosty image. So next up from Colin, this is more like it, a nice wildlife and a bird shot. Now this is a little egret. It's quite a common bird across the UK, and immediately what jumps out is it's being technically captured perfectly. It's sharp all the way across the bird, pin sharp from the head to the feet. Always easier when the bird flies nice and parallel to the camera like this. But evidently a fast shutter speed as well, because the wings are nicely frozen and there's not a loss of detail at all throughout. It's marred slightly by the composition or the cropping. So we've got a subject that's moving from right to left. However, we've got the head of the bird that's sitting very close to the left-hand side of the frame. It starts to feel a little bit claustrophobic. It really needs a bit of breathing space off to the left here. So that could be for one of two reasons. Either it's being cropped just a little bit too tightly, or when we're tracking birds in flight, it's not always easy to keep them in the middle of frame, and we may have just gotten one photograph that ended up being the sharpest with the bird right on the far left of the frame, in which case there's not a lot we can do about that apart from going out and trying again. Other than that, very, very nice shot. Next up, we've got a shot from Dennis O'Flynn here, and again, very clear subject in this shot. Beautiful framing around the side, so as a subject and compositionally it then works very well because we've got direction and we know where the eye is meant to be going to. We've got these 2 nice boats sitting on frame. If I'm being picky, it would have been nice to have 3 in shot. 3 is a much more psychologically friendly number rather than 2, but it certainly doesn't detract from the image at all. If we look at the framing around the edge, that does work nicely in a shot like that, especially when we've just got static subjects on water. Having that little bit of effectively a compositional vignette helps to draw the eye into the subject very nicely. For me, I think the detail in the bracken and the shadows have been lifted too high. Now, the reason I say that is if we look at the brightness here, we're pointing into the sun. It's the only time we get colour beams of light coming up like that. So we should expect the sky here to be pure white. We should have pure white highlights somewhere up there. If we look at the tone and the luminance of the bracken here, it's not far off some of the tones we've got going on up in the sky, which in reality is not what we would have seen. The bracken would have naturally been much darker because effectively it's being backlit by the sun. So really, I would like to see the shadows dropped a little bit, and that's going to have twofold effect. One, if we see too much detail, the eye is going to linger here rather than on the subject, and just by darkening the edge of frame, we actually help to vignette it, and that's going to help even more to draw the eye into the subject. So bar a couple of compositional gripes there, I think it's an absolutely beautiful shot. Moving on then to a shot from Judy Smith and a fantastic street style photograph. Looks like it's taken on subway, the New York Underground, something like that. Now, it's quite a grainy, gritty image, but that's not a bad thing, as long as it suits the subject matter. And I think in this case here, it does. It reminds me of old 35mm film shots. I'm assuming this is digital. It may well have been a film shot. I'm only saying digital just because of the type of grain that I can see. It's the sort of grain that you tend to get when the shadows have been lifted up just a little bit. But I think it works in this sort of image. It lends itself to that slightly gritty, dirty style of imagery. It mirrors the graffiti we've got on the window, that slightly grimy feeling I'm sure we're all familiar with when sitting on train seats. And the moment she's captured between the two subjects is absolutely fantastic. The interaction immediately generates a bit of questioning from the viewer. We think, well, what are they discussing? Are they having an argument? Are they disagreeing about something? We can see there's a bit of detail on this. This is a map, so maybe they're lost. They're trying to figure out what stop to get off. It's irrelevant, but the fact that it's been generated and I'm asking those questions makes it a strong image. It's immediately engaged the viewer. Finally, a shot from Gemma Barnes. Now this, I believe, was taken in the south of the Peak District. And I mean, first up, what an absolutely beautiful time of day this has been photographed. Sunrise with the light coming in across the side of the hills. Now, I believe Gemma said she originally spotted the mist is what drew her attention to the shot, and she said she grabbed her camera. So we've got beautiful light, very strong subject actually in terms of the tree and this saddle ridgeback just there. And the eye is always going to be drawn to the brightest point of an image. And often that's of course where the sun's going to be falling. So it actually feels like we've got two images in one. We've got the mist potential in the back there, as well as the beautiful light and this slight curve to the ridge hills here. So these are curving slightly sort of round from right to left. So I feel this would have been slightly stronger if we had more of a square crop. If I bring this in from the right hand side and go for more of a 4x5 or 4x3 style composition, we now create a much more subtle line coming through from the bottom left round to the top of the hill. Still a little bit of a mist in the background, but my eye is now not being drawn all the way out to the right hand side of frame and towards the mist there. And I feel that has got a much stronger, clearer subject to the shot. Everything else has been done perfectly. The editing, the time of day, the technicality of the shot, the depth of field is pretty spot on, it looks nice and sharp. And so that, along with, if we go for a sort of tight crop into the background there, let's do that and zoom in, bring that out, so something like that, a nice 70 to 200 millimeter or 100 to 400 millimeter lens shot with this beautiful mist sitting. So it's like we've got two in one. It's an absolute bargain, but just needs that finesse to the execution because everything else there is spot on. So a fantastic bunch of images. It's always great to see them. Hopefully you found the advice helpful, and other than that, back to Ruth.
So that's us out of time again, but as I mentioned earlier, we'll be back in just a couple of weeks when we'll be bringing you the show from Venice, where I'll be trying my hand at some street photography, plus Marcus will be taking us along on the first shoot with his new camera, so join us for that. Until then, take good care, but most of all, take good photos.
I keep spitting there. I don't know if you see that on camera.